everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Michaela Romesser, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time and talk about the E-2 visa requirements and renewal considerations. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Some of you may know that the firm Scott Legal was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago, and our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been in the US on several different visas, including F1, TN, B, and H1B. And as such, we know what you are going through. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waiver, EB-5, and extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, and this means cases where the investment amount is on the lower side. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We'll continue to have this webinar series, and we'll do at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you out some useful tools. So we'll send you the PowerPoint we'll be using today. We'll also send you a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail. We'll also send you a link where you can sign up for additional webinars we'll have in the future. And we'll also send you a link to our YouTube channel where this webinar will be posted. We'll also send you a link for our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload new immigration videos. Finally, we'll send you a link where you can set up a consultation. So today, regarding panelists, we are lucky to have one of our partners, Kelly LeGrand Weiner. And Kelly has a vast experience processing E-2 visas. Finally, for any questions you have, you can add them to the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get to all questions at the end. So finally, without further delay, let us get started with this webinar. Perfect. So what is an E-2 visa? So an E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US to develop and direct the operations of an enterprise in which he or she has invested substantial amount of money. So to qualify for an E-2 visa, there must be a treaty between the US and the foreign country you are a national of. So there are more than 60 E-2 treaty countries, and many countries from Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia are E-2 visa treaty countries. So just to state some examples, for example, Japan is a treaty country, Canada is a treaty country, France, Italy, Mexico are all E-2 visa treaty countries, and there are many, many more. What is important to keep in mind is that to qualify for an E-2 visa, you must be a national of the E-2 visa treaty country. So what does that mean? So this means that you don't have to be born in the E-2 visa treaty country. You just have to have the nationality or passport of that country. So let's say, for example, that you were born in India, which is unfortunately not an E-2 visa treaty country, and later you obtain a citizenship of, for example, the UK. You are now a UK national. You could apply for an E-2 visa under that UK passport. So for how long is your E-2 visa valid? So this will depend on your country of nationality. So different E-2 visa treaty, so nationals of different E-2 visa treaty countries can get the E-2 visa for different periods of time. So the maximum visa validity would be 5 years, and there are many, many countries that the nationals can get the E-2 visa for 5 years. So for example, nationals of Canada, the UK can get the E-2 visa issued for 5 years. So that would be the initial visa. And when you renew, you could also get it renewed like each time for up to 5 years. But there are some countries where the nationals can get the E-2 visa only for a shorter period of time. So there are some countries, that nationals can only get the E-2 visa for 3 months or 1 year or 2 years. So it really kind of depends on your country of nationality. But I will say that for the majority of countries, the kind of the visa reciprocity period, meaning the period of time you can get the E-2 visa for is kind of on the longer spectrum. So how long can you stay in the US if you, like once you get the E-2 visa? So each time you enter the US on the E-2 visa, you can stay in the US for a period of 2 years. And this is the case even if you have the E-2 visa issued in your passport for 5 years. Every time you enter the US, you will only be admitted for a period of 2 years. And so what does this mean? So let's say that you got the E-2 visa issued for a period of 5 years, and then you got it issued, and then the next week you come to the US. So what this means is that your I-94 will be limited to a period of 2 years. And this means that you will just have to leave the US before the 2-year period is up. But because you have a 5-year visa, you'll be able to come back, as long as your E-2 visa is valid. Now, let's say that you are, for example, a national of Poland. So nationals of Poland can get the E-2 visa issued only for a period of 1 year. So even in this case, let's say that you got the E-2 visa and then you come to the US, you would still be admitted for a period of 2 years, even if you only have the E-2 visa issued for a period of 1 year. So this is kind of a difference between the E-2 visa validity and then, the E-2 status you would be granted every time you come to the US on the E-2 visa. Perfect. So now, so what are the options for obtaining an E-2 visa? So there are 2 options how you can get an E-2 visa. So you can either start your own business in the US, or you can purchase an existing business in the US. So let's discuss the first option in a little bit more detail. So let's say that you have an idea for a business and you want to start the business from scratch. So what would you need to do? So you would need to set up a company in the US. This can be any sort of entity. So it can be LLC, it can be a corporation. You would have to own at least 50% in the company. Once the company is set up, you would have to apply for EIN. You would have to obtain necessary licenses. You should then set up a bank account in the US. And then you would have to make an investment in the US. So what would be the investment in case you are starting a business in the US? So you would have to basically purchase everything necessary to get that business up and running. So let's say, for example, that you want to start a restaurant. So you would have to sign a lease. Let's say you prepay for the lease for a period of 12 months, all of that, and that would be, for example, $40,000. So all of that can be included as on your investment schedule as part of your E-2 investment. If you're starting a restaurant, you'd probably need to purchase some, equipment. You would have to get licenses. You would have to, set up a website, like do some marketing. So you would basically have to kind of do all of these expenditures and pay for everything before you apply for the E-2 visa at a consulate. Now, in most cases, when people are starting a new business in the US, the new business, wouldn't have any employees before you go to the interview at the consulate. If it's the case that you do want to start, let's say that you are abroad, you are working kind of like you're finalizing the E-2 visa application, and you do want to start the operations of the US company, that is completely fine. You can hire someone who will run the company while you are in the process of applying for an E-2, and that will also help your E-2 application, because you would show that you already have an employee, the business is already taking revenue, but it's absolutely not required. And I would say that in the majority of cases where the investor is abroad and is starting a new business, the business is not kind of taking revenue yet at the time of the interview, so that's completely fine as well. So now let's discuss the second option, and that's in case you want to purchase a business in the US. So it can be any type of business. There are like not really any limitations. Franchises are a good option for E-2 visa. So you can definitely go ahead and purchase a franchise. You would still have to own at least 50% in that business, even if you're purchasing a business. And what are some things, kind of to look at when you're purchasing a business? And we can definitely kind of like assist with kind of like this process in case you are kind of looking at few different businesses. So you should look at the business's tax returns, for an E-2, the consolidate, and I would say the two most important things would be the tax returns and then the W-2s and kind of the payroll. And, like, why is that important? So, in case you are purchasing a business, the consult will want to see the tax returns and then the W-2s of the business. And the reason is that they kind of want to see, like what's the revenue of the business, like how many employees does the business have? Because employing US workers, and we'll kind of go over this in more detail, is one of the requirements for the E-2. So generally what we recommend is that the business you are purchasing has at least 3 W-2 employees. I would say that we have had cases where the number is lower, but that makes the case a little bit riskier. And in those types of cases, we do like to submit a business plan with the application, kind of explaining, like, okay, like the business right now has 1 or 2 employees, but after you take over the operations, like this is your plan, like how to hire more employees and kind of like how to increase the revenue. So I would say ideally, the business you are buying would have at least 3 employees. It is possible, to still file if it has less, but it makes the case a little bit more, a little bit riskier. So in case you are interested in purchasing a business in the US, there are 2 kind of options, like how to close the transaction. So you can either, transfer the money directly, you can purchase the business and transfer the money directly to the seller. Or there is an option to kind of structure it so the money goes through an escrow. And so what does an escrow mean? So this would mean that you would still sign a purchase sale agreement, but you would also have to sign an escrow agreement. And how it would work is that you would transfer the money to the escrow agent. And the only kind of contingency for closing the transaction would be the approval of the E-2 visa. So there can be only like one condition, one contingency in the escrow agreement, and it would basically say that like if the E-2 visa is approved, the escrow agent will transfer the money to the seller. But if for any reason the E-2 visa is not approved, like the money will go back to you. So, an escrow is definitely an option, but as I said, like all contingencies to the transaction have to be met, and the E-2 visa approval can be the only contingency left. Perfect. So now, now let's move on and let's talk a little bit about the E-2 visa requirements. So as we said, you must be a national of an E-2 visa treaty country. Because it's an E-2 investor visa, you must make an investment in the US. So what does that mean? So the money you are investing in the business must be at risk. And so what this means is that you cannot just kind of transfer the money from your personal account to the E2 company's account, and the, like let's say that you transfer $100,000, and like you would say that, like after I get the visa, like I plan to make all these E2 visa, like all these expenditures in the business. So that would not work. So what the government wants to see is that, the funds are at risk and that you already have invested the money, like by the time you have your interview. So, so there is one kind of requirement, and the government will look at, and they will look at, like where is the money for the E2 investment, like where is it coming from? And this is called source of funds. So it can, the money can really, there like no limitation. The only limitation is that it cannot come from illegal or illegitimate source. So, it can come, I would say the most common sources of funds are, for example, personal savings from employment. Often the source is that, like someone sells a property in their home country, and then the money comes from there. You could also take, the money can also come from a gift or loan. So both of those are fine. I would say for gift, one thing to keep in mind is that we would have to submit a gift letter from, like signed by the person who is gifting you the money. And then we would also have to submit evidence showing how the person obtained the money they're gifting to you. So like, let's say that a family member is gifting you $100,000 for the investment, and the money comes from, like a property they sold. We would have to submit the gift letter, and then the purchase agreement for the property, to support that the money comes from there. As I said, loans are fine for E2. The only caveat is that the loans cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 business. But like let's say that you get a loan from a financial institution that is secured by your real estate property you own in your home country, that's completely fine. If you get an unsecured loan, like that's fine as well. So now another requirement is that the E2 investment must be substantial, and we'll go over like what does substantial mean in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So what are some typical E2 visa expenditures? So in this scenario, like let's say that you are starting a business in the US, I would say some typical E2 visa expenditures would be, for example, like any money you pay for the business entity setup. So like any filing fees with the state where you are setting up the entity, any fees you pay for, like licenses, if you hire an attorney to set up the entity, like we could include that. We could include any legal fees, and then, like any kind of equipment you need. So any, like let's say computer equipment, we could include all of that. Any, like if you, like if you have an office space, we could include any money you prepay for the rent as part of the investment. Now, let's say that you'll be selling, products, then we can include any inventory you purchased by, as part of the investment. Any money you pay for, website, any money you pay for marketing. So it would basically be like anything really you kind of like need to get the business up and running. Now, if you are purchasing a business, then the investment or the expenditure would be the purchase price you pay for the business. And yeah, I think we already discussed this investment when starting versus purchasing a business. Perfect. So we can move on the next slide. So what are the other E2 visa requirements? So the E2 business cannot be marginal. And so what this means is that the E2 business must have either present or future capacity to employ US workers. So in the scenario where you are starting your own company in the US, we would generally be submitting a business plan with the application. And, as I said, like if you're starting a new business and you hire someone before you apply for E2, that would be great. And then we would submit evidence of that with the E-2 application. So we would submit things like, for example, the employment agreement, payroll, like showing that, like you are already paying an employee. And then, like let's say that that's not the case. You first want to come to the US and then start a business, that's completely fine. But in that case, what would be a really important part of the E-2 visa application would be the business plan. So in the business plan, you would have to kind of outline how many employees and on what positions do you plan to hire in the next 5 years. So we generally recommend to have 3 full-time W-2 employees by year 5 of operations. So that would be kind of the minimum. You can have part-time employees, that's fine as well, but it should be, equivalent to 3 full-time employees. So like if you have 6 part-time employees, that would be fine. Sometimes people ask, like, are independent contractors fine? I would say like it kind of depends on the business you are operating, because there are industries, like for example, if you have a construction company where it's really common to hire independent contractors. So I would say like if you kind of operate in one of these industries, it's fine, and we would kind of point to the independent contractors, but you would still want to have at least some, W-2 employees, like in that case, like for example, I don't know, like a secretary or operations manager or someone like that would be like directly employed by the E-2 company. So another requirement is that the business must be, and just one other thing, in case you are purchasing a business, and in that case, the business would already be kind of running at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa. In that case, to kind of show that the business is employing employees, you would be submitting things like, W-2s and payroll to show that, the business has employees and had employees in the past. So the next requirement would be that the E-2 business must be real and operating. So in case you are purchasing a business, you would be, to kind of show that you meet this requirement, you would be submitting things like, the company's like profit and loss statement, like showing that for the current year, like showing that the company is currently operating, taking revenue. You would be submitting things like the company's, bank statements showing kind of like the incoming payments from clients or customers, and then outgoing payments to, like for example, your employees. You would be submitting things like current licenses, like photos of the business and kind of like things like that, showing that, the business is already kind of taking revenue and operating. Now, in case that you are starting a new business and the business is not taking revenue yet at the time of your interview, you would be basically showing things that everything, like you paid for everything is set up, and the only kind of thing missing is you coming to the US and basically, like really starting the operations of the business. So you would be submitting things like, for example, evidence that you signed a lease agreement, or the E-2 company signed a lease agreement for an office space, evidence that the company has bank accounts set up, evidence that the company has all necessary licenses, evidence that the company has a website, and really, like everything is ready. And once you come to the US, the company, you will hire employees, and then the company will start taking revenues. So now you as the investor one of the requirements for the investor is that you have to come to the US to develop and direct the operations of the E-2 enterprise. So what this means is that you have to have an active role in the E-2 company. So like let's say that, for example, you own 50% in a US company, but like you want to come to the US, but you are retired and you just, like you don't want to really operate the company, but you just want to come to the US to live here. In that case, the E-2 investor visa would not be an option because you wouldn't meet the develop and direct requirement. So for this requirement, what we have to show is kind of, like what will be your role in the E-2 business. So if you will be the CEO, we would kind of describe your kind of day-to-day duties and just kind of explain, like what you'll be doing for the company. Another requirement is that you have to own at least 50% in the E-2 company. And this is a requirement, that has to be met at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, but you always have to keep at least 50% ownership in the E-2 company. So it's kind of really important thing to keep in mind, because if it drops, then you wouldn't, then you would no longer meet the E-2 visa requirements. And then you have to have intent to return to your home country when your E-2 visa expires. And so how this requirement is usually met is by submitting a signed declaration by you that just says that, like once your E-2 visa expires, you do plan to return to your home country. Now, this doesn't prevent you from, renewing the E-2 visa. You can kind of, just keep, as long as you meet the E-2 visa requirements, you can just keep renewing the E-2 visa. And yeah, the standard kind of to show the, kind of your intent to return to your home country is kind of like much lower as for other, non-immigrant visas, such as B2, where you really have to show your ties to home country. For E2, it's nothing like that. It's generally really what the consulate wants to see is the signed declaration. Perfect. So now let's discuss the substantiality requirement, and that is, like how much money you have to invest in the, in the E2 company to qualify for an E2 visa. So, there is no minimum set amount in the regulations. Like for example, for the EB5, investor green card, it's very clear in the regulation, like this is the minimum amount. For an E2, there is no minimum amount in the regulations. So the regulations just say that you have to invest substantial amount of money. So what does substantial mean, and like what does the consulate kind of like look at? So it's going to depend on a couple of things. So it's going to depend on first type of business. So let's say that you are starting kind of like a consulting company. In that case, the investment amount is going to be much lower than, for example, if you are starting kind of like a car manufacturing, type of business. So it's really going to depend on the type of business, because like for the consulting company, in nowadays, in many situations, like you don't necessarily need an office space, like you don't need, like you don't need to buy any inventory, like you don't need to buy much equipment. So like the investment is going to be like on the much lower side, versus if you're starting a business where you have to buy kind of like a lot of, like you have to rent a huge kind of like an office or a warehouse space, you have to buy a lot of initial inventory, like the investment amount is going to be, like much larger. Then it's also going to depend on where you apply and the examiner. So, there are consulates that are used to kind of seeing, like these multinational huge companies, like being registered at the consulate as E2 companies and then sending E2 employees to the US. And, this is, for example, the US consulate in Japan, that are used to kind of seeing an investment amount where, it's kind of, like hundreds of thousands of dollars or, more. So if you then come to consulate like this and your investment amount is under $100,000, then it may be, it may be denied, but like it could well be approved at a different consulate. And that's kind of like the same thing with examiners, like let's say that an examiner was working at this type of consulate for many years, and then he's transferred to another consulate, like it could still be the case that, like the examiner, him or herself, are just kind of used to seeing like much larger investment amounts. So definitely, like you want to kind of know, like if the consulate where you're applying is kind of like used to seeing like kind of, like lower investment amount. And then it's also going to depend on the overall strength of the application. So like, for example, in a situation where the investment amount is like under $100,000, but the business already has, like 2 employees, the business already taking revenue, that's going to help the case tremendously. And, like the case could still be, like very well approved. So what the government uses to kind of look at, like whether the investment is substantial, they used so-called proportionality test. So they basically kind of look at, like what's kind of like the usual investment needed to get this type of business up and running, and then they kind of like look at the investment you made, and then they will kind of make an assessment to see like if the investment is substantial. Now, if you are buying a business, then they would, the investment would be the purchase price you pay for the business, and then they look at the purchase price and then the fair market value of the business, and if they are like the same or very similar, like then that would be considered substantial. So as we discussed already, franchises are a great option for E-2 visas. And now I can just mention some, good versus bad E-2 visa expenditures. So some good ones would be, for example, as I mentioned before, like any money you pay to set up the entity, any money you pay, like for licenses, any money you pay for like marketing, website, or to contractors, to set up the website, things like that. If you are going to be selling products, like any money you pay for the inventory, like any money you pay for equipment, like computer equipment, printers, scanners, things like that. Some bad or, like weak E-2 visa expenditures would be, for example, like let's say that you come to the US on a B visa to kind of set up the entity, set up the bank account, and then you want to include like the flights and then the hotel receipt and then Uber and meals, like these would be expenditures we wouldn't, like we wouldn't include because, like they would be considered very weak E-2 visa expenditures. And another one we often get asked about is, like, can I include a car, I purchased as part of the E-2 visa investment. So here, like, unless the car is kind of like really kind of necessary for you to operate the business, like we wouldn't include it. So like, let's say, for example, that, like you have a consulting business and then you purchase a car and then you want to include it as part of the investment because like you will, like use the car to kind of commute to the office every day. And we have kind of seen it that the consulate just kind of, like don't, like really consider it a weak E-2 visa expenditure, so we wouldn't include it. Now, on the other hand, like let's say that you have a construction company and you purchased a truck, so your contractors or employees, like can like go to client sites and like bring the equipment there. In that case, like we will definitely include the truck. So it's just gonna depend on what's the, the type of the business. Perfect. So do I have to hire US employees? I think I went over this briefly already, but the E-2 business, as I said, like must have either a present or future capacity to generate enough income to provide more than a minimal living for you and your family. And so what this means is that the government wants to see that the business will be earning enough revenue to be able to employ workers. So as we discussed, like if you're starting a new business, you do want to submit a really strong business plan in which you will outline the hiring projections for the next 5 years. In case you already have an operating business, you will want to submit evidence that payroll showing the current employees, and then W-2s and 1099s showing that the company had employees or contractors in the past. And then, as I said, the general recommendation would be to have W-2 employees, but there are some industries where independent contractors are, hiring independent contractors is common to the industry. So those may be fine, but as I said, like even in that case, you do want to have at least like one employee or some employees like being W-2 employees. Perfect. Yeah, so, and I think I just went over this, like how do you show that you have the employees? So in the new business, it would be the business plan, and then existing business, it would be the W-2s, payroll, and then also tax returns, like showing the salaries paid to the employees. Perfect. And Kelly will now take over and we'll talk about business plan considerations.
Perfect. Thank you, Michaela. Also, just wanted to note, I know there's some questions coming in and we will reserve time for questions at the end. So do I need a business plan? This is a common question we receive from clients. And if you're starting a new business, the answer is absolutely yes, you do need a business plan. This is listed on many of the consulate websites as well. Some consulates even ask that the business plan financials be certified by a CPA. So it is important to pay attention to those requirements because certain consulates will require that of the business plan, that certification. When you're starting a new business, it's really important to have, that business plan, as Michaela, explained, to meet kind of the marginality requirements, the real and operating requirements, to show that the business will have the capacity to hire U.S. workers, to show that the business will have the capacity to make a significant economic contribution, as it gets started. So because there's really no actual financials at that time, it's a pure startup. The business plan is a really key document for any E-2 startup application. If you're purchasing an existing business, it's a little bit more flexible. So if you're purchasing an existing business that has, very substantial kind of revenues and profit, that has, a history of hiring, workers in the U.S., can provide like significant W-2s and things like that, you may not need a business plan. Because you already have the proof that the business is real and operating, you have the proof that the business meets the marginality requirement, is hiring, has hired workers in the US and will continue to employ those people. That being said, if you're purchasing a business and maybe you're adding on a new service line, or perhaps the business has not been doing very well, maybe it had a big dip in revenue during the pandemic and never quite recovered. So in those situations, when you're purchasing an existing business, you may want to include a business plan that can give you the opportunity to show the officer, even though the revenues have been flat, or even though, they've only had 2 employees, here's my, realistic plan to build up the operation, so that it can meet these E-2 requirements. What should the business plan contain? So these are really the key sections that they're going to be looking for. So one is the executive summary. What does the business do? Who does the business sell to? What's the general description of what this business is? Sometimes it's very straightforward. If it's a restaurant, it's a gas station. Sometimes it's a bit more complex. And in those cases, it's really important that the executive summary contain a very concise, logical, understandable explanation of what the business does. The officer is generally not going to be an expert in the particular industry you're working in. So again, you want to make it really, really clear to them, what this business does. You also want to provide market analysis and research to show, there's a market for this. There's a lot of people that are interested in this business. There's a lot, talking about your competitors. If you don't have any competitors, that's not good. Generally, you need to have competitors to show, look, there's a market that supports, this type of business. A marketing plan is very important. How are you going to get clients? How are you going to attract clients? Particularly in a startup scenario, they really do want to see that you have a realistic plan for how people are going to find your business and hire you. A personnel plan is very important. And this should be, a 5-year hiring projection that includes job titles. You should include an explanation of the job duties. You should include an explanation of raises over the years. All of that goes into creating a, realistic hiring plan. And then a comprehensive financial plan. So 5 years of financial projections, generally, a profit and loss statement, a balance sheet, and cash flow. This can be very important, again, in a startup scenario, to show that this business has a realistic plan for how it's going to make money, how it's going to hire workers in the US. So they do want to see that detail when they look at the business plan. All right, let's talk a little bit about some developments and adjudication trends for the E-2 visa. So one is, investment purchases in the US. So it is not required anywhere in the law that the investment purchases be made in the United States. That being said, the purpose of the E-2 Treaty Investor Program is to facilitate, economic benefit between the treaty countries, and for the E-2, particularly for the US. Additionally, with some of the executive orders we're seeing and what we saw, the last time, during the last administration, it is beneficial to, to make those investment purchases in the US. They will sometimes ask about it and, look at it holistically, in the idea of, are you doing, have you spent money in the US, therefore are you, already facilitating, some economic benefit in the US? So we do think it can be helpful, even though it's not required. Administrative processing. So administrative processing, there's really two types. One is essentially the consulate issuing what's like almost a request for evidence. And if you're put into administrative processing, what will happen is at the interview, you'll receive a form called a 221G. This is a technical denial. And then sometimes they'll ask you for some information. So if there's something they wanted to see in the petition that they didn't see, they would ask for it there. Or let's say, they want proof that, when you were previously in the US that you maintained your status, they may ask for it there. Those types of administrative processing requests that, just ask for some additional information, those can generally be approved relatively quickly, particularly if it's kind of a simple document related to the E-2 company. That's because the consulate can then review it and make a final decision. Another type of administrative processing is when your application has been flagged, not necessarily by the consulate, but by another agency. And that agency needs to do some clearance on the flag before they can allow the case to proceed. In those types of scenarios, those are often things related to national security, or if kind of a name, came up on some kind of background check. And in those instances, it can be, harder to predict how long it will take before administrative processing, kind of can end. And that's because the consulate has no ability to move forward with the case until this other agency clears the case. And in those cases, they don't make that clear to the applicant, because it's a national security issue. They're really not transparent about it, other than to say, yes, please continue to check back with us, maybe every 30 days, every 60 days, every 90 days, and we will let you know when your case is ready to proceed. So that can be a bit more, challenging to manage. And, I think we'll start to see that more, especially with new executive orders, asking for kind of maximum vetting of all foreign nationals. I think we will start to see that used more moving forward. So more filings with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So when you do the E-2, you have two options. One is that you can file if you're in the United States in a valid status, like you're in a B1 business visitor status, you can file for a change of status to E-2. The benefit of this is it allows you don't have to leave the country to attend an interview. You can pay an additional fee, a premium processing fee, to get an answer within 15 business days. If you do a filing with USCIS, they also are more friendly to kind of lower investment amounts. So sometimes that can be beneficial. Then again, there's also some downsides. For example, with USCIS filings, they're very strict at looking at the source and trail of funds. More USCIS filings became kind of very common during the pandemic, when people were obviously unable to travel as easily. And they have continued, kind of to present day. Some of that is because, we'll also talk about timing at consulates. So there are some consulates where things are really back to normal, back to normal in the sense that they're processing visas at the same, time frame or rate that they were prior to the pandemic. There are some consulates where this is still not the case. Consulates, when they closed and then when they reopened, it was a very ad hoc process where each consulate was kind of given the ability to kind of reopen and to prioritize certain visa processing, based on country conditions and what was going on in the country. This means that there are certain consulates like London, like Toronto, like in Japan, where the processing times are very predictable and, have kind of come back to normal processing times. But there's still some consulates where it's very unpredictable, where there is, still significant delays. For example, in Colombia, it took them quite a long time to, reopen E-2 processing. And because of that, there's a very significant backlog that they're still working through today. So if you are considering the E-2, it is important to think about where could you possibly apply, and then try to find out what is the timing at that consulate. It's not always possible to find out exact timing. Some consulates list publicly on their website what the timing is. Some consulates don't, but you can reach out to ask. It does depend a lot, but it is a more complex type of visa, so it generally does take longer, to review and to get an interview. Let's talk about some issues in complex areas for the E-2 visa. So one is the source and trail of funds. So, as Michaela mentioned earlier, the requirement for the source of funds is that it has to come, cannot come from an illegitimate source. It has to be personal funds of the investor from a proven legitimate source. If you're going to a consulate, they generally take a very high level view of this, right? If you say it's savings from my employment, you can probably produce some tax returns and then proof of you transferring money to the United States, and that's generally sufficient. If you're doing this with a USCIS filing, so if you're filing for a change of status, as I just mentioned, then it's much more complex, where they really do want to see a dollar for dollar accounting of all the money, up through the time that it's actually spent on the E-2 expenditures. So for example, if you're, doing the savings from employment, tax returns alone would not be sufficient. They would also want to see the pay stubs, see your bank statement showing the money from your payroll entering your bank account and being maintained there, and then being transferred and being spent on the E-2 expenditures. So let's say that you get, a paycheck of $2,000 into your bank account, and then you spend that, on groceries and rent and other things. That has not been maintained in the bank account. That's not going to be able to be used as part of the E-2 expenditure. So if you do have a very complex source and trail of funds situation where you're getting maybe money from multiple sources, or maybe it's gone through multiple bank accounts and it hasn't been maintained anywhere clearly, you may want to reconsider a USCIS filing, because that will, that could be a large barrier to approval. Another issue that comes up a lot are loans secured by the company assets. So if you are doing an E-2, visa, you can get a loan as your source of funds if it is a personal loan that is unsecured, or a personal loan that is secured by your personal assets. So let's say you take out, you own a home in your name, and you take out a mortgage on that home, or you have an unsecured line of credit in your personal name. Those things can be used for the E-2 investment. However, any loans secured by the assets of the E-2 company cannot be used. So for example, this comes up a lot in seller financing situations. If somebody's going to purchase a business and they're not going to pay the full purchase price, they want to purchase just a percentage of it and then use seller financing for the rest. So this generally is not a good option for the E-2, because in that case, seller financing is generally, secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So you do have to keep that in mind. If you are taking out a loan, it cannot be secured by the business. It has to be secured by your personal assets or unsecured in your personal name. Gifts are another area people ask about. So a gift can be the source of funds for an E-2 investment. However, before you go this route, you have to make sure that the gift giver is comfortable providing all of their financial documentation. Because you would submit a gift letter, but then you also have to submit the proof that the gift giver got this money from a legitimate source. So, if it's personal savings from employment, that's going to be tax returns. If it's, sale of a property, it's going to be proof of the sale of the property and then receiving the money and having that maintained. So, doing a gift does not allow you to kind of bypass the requirement for the financial documents. You still have to provide those. Other areas that can come up, small investment amount, and we have a particular webinar that focuses just on how to deal with small investment amounts and what strategies you can use. There's, as Michaela mentioned, there's certain consulates that are more favorable to smaller investment amounts, and others where they're really not favorable, because, the officers are usually seeing, very high investment amounts. USCIS, if you do a change of status, they are more friendly towards smaller investment amounts, but it has to make sense in light of the type of business you're starting. So if you're starting a business that, that requires a lot of, fixed costs, you're not necessarily going to be able to get away with an investment of $20,000, versus if you were starting up a law firm or a service-based business with very few, equipment requirements and things like that, you may be able to get away with a much smaller investment amount, at USCIS. And then there's certain consulates that are also more favorable to smaller investors. Toronto is one of them, London is another. Other things that come up, E-2 visas for two investors. So if you have a business partner and you are each going to own the business 50-50, then you could potentially both get E-2 investor visas. You do have to own the business at least 50%, to qualify as an E-2 investor. People also ask a lot about substantive changes to the business after filing. So one thing that we always want to caution people is that when you get your E-2 visa, you are getting the approval to run the type of business that you have submitted to the consulate. So if you got an E-2 visa for a restaurant and you now no longer want to run that restaurant and you want to open up a business consulting company, You cannot do that under the same LLC without first getting an approval either from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services or by going back to the consulate. However, if there's kind of a natural outgrowth to your company, like let's say you're a wedding photographer, now you want to, add a blog to that that's on wedding related, activities, that likely is fine. That likely won't be considered a substantive change that would require going back to the consulate. Especially if you have kind of in your mind that you want your business to do multiple things, it's a good idea to contemplate it in the business plan at the start of the process. So let's say that you want to offer software consulting services, but down the road, around year 3 or 4, you want to add mobile app development. You can contemplate that in your initial business plan when you submit it to the consulate, and that can sometimes help down the road where you would not need to go back and ask for any approvals because it's already been contemplated in the initial application that the consulate or USCIS approved. Another area that can come up are family business purchases. So if you are purchasing a business from a family member or someone that it's not an arm's length transaction, you're going to receive more scrutiny at the consulate about whether you're investing the fair market value, if you're really paying the fair market value for the business. So you do want to make sure that the amount you're paying makes sense in light of the financials you're submitting. It's a really good idea to get a valuation from an objective third party, whether that's a valuation company or if it's from a CPA who looks at it and explains what is the basis for valuing the business in this way. That can be very helpful, when you go to the consulate to explain, yes, I have invested the full amount, even though I'm purchasing it from a family member. All right, some common reasons for E-2 denials. One is low investment amount. So as we've talked about, there's some venues where it's just, not going to work. If you're having a really, really low investment amount, and there's some amounts that are just too low. We had a client who came to us once and had filed on his own, spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That investment amount is just too low. They're not going to believe you've committed enough funds that are of the magnitude to guarantee that you will proceed with the business. Another can be the nature of the business. So certain types of businesses are a bit more high risk, things related to real estate, things related to consulting, anything where they're, concerned that you're not actually going to hire workers or there's not a real and operating business. So always keep that in mind. Filing location and venue. So we've discussed at length, there's certain consulates that are going to be more or less friendly to certain types of applications. You want to keep that in mind. Concern over whether the business will create jobs for U.S. workers. So let's say you've been a solo consultant, in your home country for 10 years, and now you want to start a consultancy in the U.S. They may not believe your business plan. They may say, well, yes, you say you have a business plan, but you've run in a similar company for 10 years. You never hired anybody. In that case, it may be beneficial to hire somebody before you file. So you do want to make sure that you're addressing those concerns proactively. It can also be issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have varying levels of expertise. Sometimes, if they're earlier on in their training, they may not, be aware of what they should be doing. And sometimes you get an officer who's just having a bad day. If you are, having that type of situation, we always recommend you want to be as polite as possible. It is the case that the officer has complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa. And then later, if you feel the officer was really out of bounds or there was, a real legal mistake, there's certain avenues you can pursue, or you could always try to reapply. Most consulates will try to give you a different officer the second time around. Another issue could be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people will maybe not understand the E-2 requirements and will file. Perhaps, the entire investment is secured by the company's assets, or perhaps, the treaty country national only owns 20% of the business. In those cases, they can't approve at that point, but you can always try to, change the situation, remedy the issues and reapply. What does it take to renew an E-2 visa? So one of the biggest things is hiring U.S. workers. This is very key. You want to show that the business is not marginal, that it will support more than just the investor and their family. They will want to see that you've hired workers. We usually recommend trying to have around 3 to 5, workers by, year 5. That being said, we have renewed with less, but it does really strongly depend on the situation of your case. And can you make a strong argument about why you didn't hire more? They're going to want to see updated financial data. So most often they want tax returns for 2 years. There are some consulates that ask for tax returns for 5 years. They'll want to see, is the company profitable? They'll want to see payroll information. If the company is not doing well, you may consider including like a supplementary business plan that shows, hey, here's how to get back on track. That was a very common thing during COVID as well, when people may have hired and then they had to fire everybody and then they were in the process of rehiring. Also, they're going to look at, does the company still meet the E-2 requirements? So if there's been any changes to the ownership, if the treaty country nationality has fallen below 50%, that would be a major barrier to renewal. Also, they'll look at changes to the type of business. So if your business has, changed its service lines or, kind of gone in a certain direction, you want to explain that in the renewal, and you want to make sure that it aligns with, your previous, business to, again, like a change from a restaurant to a business consulting company, that's going to be, too substantial. You would have needed to go back and get that approval, before making that change. All right, so we have reached the end of the PowerPoint, and I think we do have some questions that have come in. So I'll handle some of these and ask Michaela to weigh in as well. So one, do employees have to be full-time or part-time? It can be either, but it's beneficial to have, if you're going to have part-time, it's beneficial to have at least a couple full-time employees. For dual citizens currently in H-1B status on a non-treaty passport, is adjustment of status to E-2, I think that means change of status to E-2, possible without having to leave the country? Unfortunately, the answer is no. If you've entered the country on a non-treaty country passport, you would have to leave and re-enter on the treaty country passport to be able to change your status to E-2. You could also go to a consulate. Michaela, could you handle this one? Can you buy real estate like multifamily or small plaza? And can you talk about some minimum investments?
Yeah, so real estate, kind of E-2 real estate companies. So we have done many E-2s for like real estate property management companies. So like if that's something, it sounds like that's something you're contemplating, but generally for this type of business, like you have to do it kind of like on a really like large scale. So like it's fine if like some of the portfolio are like properties you own, but then you would want to show that the E-2 company will be also managing like other like other properties. And generally you really have to be doing it on like large scale, like managing, I don't know, like 30, 50, like properties or something like that.
Yeah, I think like one thing that doesn't work for E-2 in real estate is you can't just kind of buy a plaza or buy a home. That does not work. And I know you're talking about minimum investments. I think for real estate, often the investments do end up having to be higher. For example, we had a client who was doing kind of commercial real estate development. The investment amount was somewhere around, 3 million. It's not to say that's the only type of investment, and you can do other types of, real estate companies, but just purchasing a property outright, alone is not enough to show a real and operating E-2 business. What documents are needed to provide to prove the source of funds? So this is going to depend on what the source of funds is. So as I mentioned during this presentation, if it's savings from employment, that's going to be tax returns and bank statements. If it's, sale of a property, that's going to be proof of the purchase sale agreement and proof of you receiving the money and maintaining it. So it's really going to depend on what the source is. Someone's asking about whether so the session is being recorded, and yes, will be made available. Michaela, can you handle this one? How do you prove the intent to return back to your home country if you don't have property in your home country?
Yeah, so as I said, for E-2, the only document really the government wants to see is a signed declaration saying that you do have intent to return to your home country, and you do not have to show that you own property in your home country. So that's, not required. So you would be just submitting that, signed declaration.
Perfect. So someone's asked, in your experience, if someone makes $100,000 investment, what is a typical take-home amount? I'd say we really can't respond to this one with any type of, numbers, because it varies very significantly. We have, many, many clients who are in many, many different areas. And so for that, you really need to kind of figure out your own, financial plan for your business. And that's going to tell you kind of what take-home, is for that. Someone's asked, they have an approved I-140 from 2013 with a priority date current in the next 2 years. Does that impact the intent to return to your home country? It can. So when you submit the DS-160, you are submitting something that indicates whether you have an immigrant petition pending. So they certainly could ask about it, particularly if the priority date is getting closer. That being said, if on your I-140 you indicated you're going to consular process, there's arguments that you can try to use, to explain that you do not have the intent at this particular time to adjust your status. Michaela, can you handle this one? if a portion of the acquired business is seller financed, does that amount count towards the investment?
Yeah, so as Kelly discussed, unfortunately not, like that, that would not work for the E2.
Right. If that seller financing if the situation is the business is, the security for that financing, then that's not going to count. When applying for the E-2 renewal, what is the best process for application submission? So this is a very specific question about someone's situation in terms of where they're settled. I'd say for things like that are very, very specific about your situation, I'd suggest setting up a consultation, to discuss that, in detail. I think generally the question of can you reapply at a consulate or should you go through USCIS? The main thing to keep in mind is if you go through USCIS, you will not get a visa stamp in your passport that allows you to travel internationally. So that's often not a good option. Going back to the consulate where you were initially approved is usually your best bet because they've already seen and approved the case. And some places like Toronto have streamlined processes for renewals. Someone's asking after the webinar, can we ask some questions? So what you can do is you can go to our website and set up a consultation, and we would be happy to answer any questions you have, during the consultation. So Michaela, can you handle this one? Any special requirements for dependents with an E-2 renewal? You've had a child in the US and they hold a US passport.
Yeah, so in that case, you would just be renewing E2 visa for you, spouse, and any, children that are not US citizens. I believe there is a question on the DS-160 that asks, like, do you have any family members in the US? So, like, then you would have to disclose that you have a child, and it may ask about the immigration status. So you would have to, disclose it there. But other than that, this is a common thing. You would just have to disclose it on the, on the DS-160, and if the consular officer, asks about it, just to, respond. But yeah, the U.S. citizen child would not be kind of like a part of the E-2 renewal application.
Yeah, so someone has a question about the cost. So I'd say reach out to us by email. We're happy to send our engagement letter and our fees by email. Someone's clarifying, is the Toronto consulate more favorable for smaller investments? Yes, it is a relatively good consulate for small investments. Michaela, so if married, can the investment amount come from both accounts?
Yeah, so that's if you're applying at a consulate, yeah, that's generally fine if if you transfer it from yours or your spouse's account. Yeah.
So if you set up a new company, is it okay to set up in Delaware for tax concerns? Yes, you can set up anywhere you prefer in the US. However, if your business is primarily going to operate from another state, then you would also likely need to register to do business in that other state. Someone's asked, can you briefly explain how does the process of the renewal look like? So generally, I think we went over this in the presentation, the renewal is going to be focused on kind of the company's tax returns, the W-2s, what is the progress? Does the company still meet all the E-2 requirements in terms of ownership and actually operating? You don't have to prove any new investment. So that can be kind of something I think people get confused about. But, and then the renewal process at each consulate is going to be, is going to vary, but it's very similar to the initial application where you kind of submit it, they'll review it and then call you for an interview. Michaela, can you take the next one? I'm in the US and I've started a food truck business. Can I change my visa status from E3S to E2?
Yeah, so you can you can definitely file a change of status application with the USCIS. I would say like one thing to kind of keep in mind is that if the food truck is already operating and you are changing status with the USCIS, because E3S doesn't, the E3S status doesn't allow you to work, you would want to point to like employees that are kind of like managing that business. But yeah, like as long as you are in the US maintaining status, you can change status to a different status.
Yes, and I think E3S does allow you to work as an E3 dependent. So I think that generally would be okay. Do we have to take an appointment and have an in-person meeting, or can we send documents? If you are applying at a consulate, then you do have to go to a meeting with an immigration officer. If you are applying for a change of status, then you just submit the paperwork. You don't attend an interview. Someone's asked, they've created a company and their father is a US citizen, and they're asking, can they apply for an EIN through their father? So if the father is a partial owner of the company, then you can get the EIN, through that. So Michaela, would a catering business work for the E2? And what are some investments we've seen for that?
Yeah, like we have definitely done E2s for catering business. The minimum investment, like I don't recall from the top of my head, but like again, like it would be the, everything you kind of like need to get that business, like up and running, like any equipment you need, any space you need for that business. But yeah, like for that type of business, it could be around like 100,000, and like part of that could be working capital.
Perfect. Someone's asked, what if my business has more than 10 employees working remote, working with US contractors and other organizations? So I'd say that you would need to hire people in the United States. That would be our strong recommendation. I'm not sure what this is asking. It's asking about for renewal. So we're going to move on. Currently I'm in the US, but I will apply for my consulate once all my documents are business ready. Yes, that's fine. Somebody's asking about spouses and dependents. Michaela, can you go over those rules for the E-2 visa?
Yeah, so E2 spouses are allowed to work in the US. They like nowadays they don't have to apply for a specific work authorization. They can just work based on the like I-94 E2S status. Children, unmarried, and under the age of 21 can get E2 dependent visa. Children can study in the US, but they are not allowed to work.
Someone's asking if it's preferable to go with Toronto instead of flying to the embassy you applied at in the beginning. Does consulate location matter? So it does matter. This is really something where you need to set up a consultation so we could weigh the pros and cons, because there's not a simple kind of yes or no answer to that. If an E-2 has been filed for one business and while living in the US, we decide to close and invest in another business, do we refile the E-2? So you should, you should definitely, you would need it to have a new E-2 for the new business. So that would be, I'd say it's quite a complicated, like if you're living in the US and you close down your E-2 business, you have a 60-day grace period to remain before you need to depart. So it is something where you'd want to speak with an attorney and kind of plan that carefully to make sure you don't have any time out of status, and discuss with your attorney before you close your E-2 business, because that can be very tricky and can lead to some issues. How long is the process to get the visa? It depends. It depends where you're applying. For example, with the USCIS, you can pay to get a response in about 15 business days, approval, denial, or request for evidence. The consulate in Toronto, they're taking about 3 weeks to review, and then maybe another 3 or 4 weeks to get an appointment. At other consulates, it can take months. In London, it's taking, 60, 70 working days to get an appointment. So it really does vary depending on where you're applying. A 2-member LLC is required partnership agreement or operating agreement, which is good for the E-2 visa. If you're doing a 2-member LLC, an LLC is going to have an operating agreement. So that can work. A partnership, if you do a partnership, that also can potentially work. All right, thank you for all your great questions. Michaela, thank you for sharing your knowledge. It was, I think, a great presentation, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.